All right, I think most people are in. So hi, I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA Stratcom Academic Alliance speaker session entitled Long Shadows, Deterrence in a Multipolar Nuclear Age. I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn, for taking the time to speak with us today. Before we get started though, just a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll have a Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentation. So during the brief or during the Q&A, go ahead and submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen. Also, go ahead and submit all of your questions today to Ms. Sarah Canna. Her name is going to be listed as questions-Sarah Canna, and questions that aren't submitted to Sarah specifically may not be addressed. So please send those questions to Sarah. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address that question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. Please make sure to also keep your video and audio off for the duration of this event. And we're just looking to improve our bandwidth for our speaker. All right, so I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker before I turn the floor over to her. Dr. Stacy Pettyjohn is a senior fellow and the director of the defense program at the Center for a New American Security. Her areas of expertise include defense strategy, posture, force planning, the defense budget, and wargaming. And prior to joining CNAS, Dr. Pettyjohn spent over 10 years at the RAND Corporation as a political scientist. And in 2020, she was a volunteer on the Biden administration's defense transition team. So without any further ado, Dr. Pettyjohn, the floor is yours, and I will stop sharing my slides.
Thank you, Nicole, and thanks to everybody for tuning in here. Let's see if I can manage to share my screen and get up some slides that are at least going to provide us with something to look at that's not just people's faces. So I'm going to provide you a little bit of context about the project and the report that I'm going to discuss today, which is one that was released sometime, I think, in the last month at CNAS, Long Shadows, Nuclear Deterrence in the Multipolar Age. This is the initial report and the beginning of a longer stream of research that I've begun here at CNAS. And as I began to think about nuclear deterrence, I was sort of motivated by the notion that a lot of things were changing, not necessarily in huge, gigantic shifts that were readily visible to everyone. And I was trying not to be overly hyperbolic about it either. I think that there's been a lot of breathless claims about what China's doing, its potential orbital bombardment system, the different missile fields and things that it's developing. And I wanted to really just sort of look at what was happening. And my suspicion was that there were a lot of shifts that were underway that were underappreciated and that made nuclear deterrence going forward a more challenging issue. But I actually needed to do the research to start that and then to think about the follow-on streams and sort of what you do to actually strengthen the deterrence going forward. So this is the initial survey of the United States and its three nuclear armed rivals, Russia, China, and North Korea, and just sort of taking stock on where we are when this report was written, which was at the beginning of 2022. I will try to go through this pretty quickly so we have more time for conversation, since this is probably a lot of information that many of you are quite familiar with. But after the Cold War ended, you just saw this dramatic shift in US strategic thinking and defense policy, where nuclear weapons have become something that have been sort of siloed off and pushed aside because we didn't really need to worry about it, which was a good thing. The likelihood of any sort of nuclear exchange outside of one that was employed by a terrorist organization seemed really remote. And so US policy focused on reducing the role of nuclear weapons in defense strategy and plans, and trying to reduce the role of nuclear weapons globally through arms control and sometimes unilateral restraint. And you see there was this dramatic drop from the end of the Cold War to where we are today, thanks to a lot of the arms control agreements like New START and predecessors, which helped to convince the United States and Russia to shrink their arsenals. But this trend of moving towards a nuclear-free world, or at least that was the aspiration that many folks in the United States, especially the Obama administration, but also President Biden has expressed a similar sort of goal, hasn't actually borne out in practice. And what you find is that while the United States continually was trying to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in strategy and policy, that other countries were still continuing to think about the role of nuclear weapons in their strategy in ways that it could provide them with leverage and influence going forward. So you have Russia still maintained its strategic arsenal, and what's not reflected on this chart is its non-strategic nuclear arsenal, which is the largest in the world. You also have China ever so slowly creeping up in terms of the total number of warheads and a significant modernization in terms of its delivery systems. And North Korea has continued to pursue a nuclear weapon, though it's taken it quite some time, and finally successfully had a nuclear test in 2017 that, sort of had it cross the threshold, and since then has been building a small stockpile of nuclear arms. So I'm going to go through each of the 4 countries and just sort of provide a couple of highlights of some of the trends that we see and the situation as of today, and then do a quick comparative assessment with my conclusions and sort of questions for future research, which is really what this project is all about, setting those questions up and figuring out what issues need to be focused upon. So the United States, as everybody knows, is in the middle of modernizing its entire nuclear system and infrastructure, the triad, warheads, everything. This has been after a fairly significant period in which most modernization of major nuclear programs was deferred. And you see that big gap there, though this chart is pretty small. It's in the report, and it was so nicely done by my graphic artist that I wanted to include it. But the big takeaway is right now the United States has a lot of systems that are quite old and desperately in need of upgrades. That is happening. The costs are just starting to come due in terms of the budget. I think they really begin to hit in the next several years as we look at what the program's actually fielding new systems, and the B-21 GBSD, or now known as the Sentinel, the Minuteman replacement, and the Columbia-class SSBN actually are being built and delivered, not just the research and development. But this sort of period of stasis in many ways in the United States has not been met by other countries. So if you look at Russia, there are a lot of questions about Russian military capability and how effective it is, and whether we should believe its claims. As everyone looks at Ukraine, we realize that the Russian military has underperformed in the conventional sphere fairly significantly, and we've seen some problems with targeting and its missiles. But Russia has also been modernizing its nuclear systems, and that is nearly complete, more so than the conventional modernization program that it's been undergoing. And it has been a fairly holistic approach where they have improved all of their strategic delivery systems, but also upgraded their non-strategic nuclear weapons, which they have, I think, something like 2,500. And then this chart here is showing a separate category. Most of these would probably fall into the strategic area, though not entirely. And these are what we would call the novel delivery systems, which have been developed and pursued largely in response to US national missile defenses, and Russia trying to ensure that it has a robust second strike capability. So within here you have the Avant-Garde, the hypersonic glide vehicle, which goes on top of one of the very large ICBMs that Russia has, the air-launched ballistic missile, which reportedly may have even been employed in Ukraine with a conventional variant, which is really just an Iskander missile that's air-launched. You have the Poseidon system, and other hypersonic systems. And some of these are fairly ambitious, might be a nice way to put it. It's not clear that they will actually be fielded anytime soon, but you can see from this that Russia has actually fielded the Avant-Garde and the Kinzhal, and is close on the Tirskan. I'm going to screw up that pronunciation terribly. And has actually made fairly significant progress in terms of hypersonics, so that it has an ability to evade missile defense systems. When you look at China, this is where you've seen the most sort of announcements, I think, and the ones that have received the most attention in the press in the last few years. This is just a picture from the Federation of American Scientists that shows some of the missile silo fields that have been discovered in Western China, which could potentially house up to 300 new intercontinental ballistic missiles, which would be a significant expansion of the silo-based ICBM force that China has, which previously was pretty small. But this is just part of a broader build-up that includes a significant expansion in terms of the number of warheads. The recent DoD report projected that China would have 700 nuclear warheads by 2027 and as many as 1,000 in 2030. If it were to fill all these silo fields with its new DF-41 ICBM with multiple warheads on it, that could account for many of those. It's also fielded its H-6N nuclear bomber, which has an air-launched ballistic missile variant of the DF-21 that can be nuclear armed, and is building a next generation stealthy bomber. I think it's the H-20. It has fielded 6 of its Jinglas SSBNs. They're still not very good, and the missiles that they carry are limited in their range, and therefore they would have to move outside of the waters immediately near the Chinese mainland to range all of the United States. But they're getting better, and they're working on the next class of submarine as well. In addition, you have China has fielded hypersonic weapons. Its medium-range ballistic missile, the DF-17, is reportedly armed with a hypersonic glide vehicle. Its DF-21 and DF-26 MR and IRBMs, which are supposedly very accurate, also are dual capable. So there are the conventionally armed variants that we're concerned about, but they also may be nuclear armed, and those are the missiles that there are anti-ship variants as well. And finally, you have the potential of the orbital bombardment system, which received a lot of attention, where it looked like China was trying to develop it as something that the Soviets had during the Cold War, where they can put a fractional orbital bombardment system up into orbit, that it can go around and evade missile defense radars and potentially strike anywhere in the Earth. The deployment was particularly significant because it looked like there was a hypersonic glide vehicle on it as well, and then it deployed something else, which suggests that it was a fairly advanced system, though all of that, there's still spotty information on it. The big story here, though, is that China's nuclear posture is changing significantly from what it has in the past. It has definitely moved away from a posture that could only support a minimum deterrent strategy like it used to have, into something that provides it with a lot of options, where it could change its policy and its posture, its level of readiness, and appears to be doing so going forward. And then you have North Korea. And I debated whether to include North Korea in this project because it's so dissimilar to the other states in terms of the scale of its capabilities. But I think we're remiss if we ignore North Korea and the fact that it is a nuclear armed state now, even though it has probably a very small arsenal, and is working on delivering an increasingly sophisticated array of different missile systems that could be nuclear capable. So North Korea has come a long way from just having the Musadong and the Nodong MRBMs, which are inaccurate and in some cases not very reliable. It has now been testing a new generation of short-range ballistic missiles that could be nuclear armed, which are pretty accurate. It's also tested a new land attack cruise missile of 1,000 kilometers, I think, so significantly longer range than any sort of cruise missile it has right now. And both of these developments suggest that it may be fielding what we would call tactical or non-strategic systems that it plans to use in the event of a conflict on the peninsula. I know Kim Jong-un also recently said something about the Army having new responsibilities, and that suggested that some of these systems might be deployed to units along the DMZ. And then, of course, it's continuing to pursue intercontinental ballistic missile. You have the massive Hwasong 17, let's see if I can say it, there that is just this gigantic missile, and North Korea is making progress in terms of its ability to strike anywhere in the world. So when you look at them in 2021 and the number of warheads simply, so this is one very crude sort of metric and way of slicing the data, but you can see that China and North Korea are still well below the United States and Russia. And this includes the deployed and as well as the non-deployed warheads that the United States and Russia have in reserve, or the intact warheads that they're planning to dismantle but have not yet done so. But they're still head and shoulders above the newer nuclear powers with China and really North Korea. China's had nuclear weapons for a long time, but China's burgeoning arsenal is still quite a bit smaller than either of the former superpowers from the Cold War. But when you start looking at trends and think about this over time, the picture changes a little bit. So this chart shows you what the United States and Russia have deployed. Those are the dotted lines in the middle. And those are the treaty limited number of warheads that, according to New START, that each has. And then you have the total number of warheads, which corresponds to that larger number, those reserve and intact, but going to be dismantled warheads. And you can see at the bottom, China, if it is moving towards that 1,000 nuclear warheads in 2030, and North Korea at a rather modest rate of growth. I think that is 6 warheads a year, starting with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists projection for today, which was something like, I think, 40 warheads. That they're creeping up. North Korea is still way down there at the bottom, but China is moving towards the number of deployed US and Russian strategic systems potentially. These numbers could potentially change further if New START is not renewed and those limits end up not constraining the United States and Russia. So there's more in flux than you would think. And if New START remains in effect and the US and Russia continue to abide by the limits, China, it could be creeping up towards the number of deployed warheads. So the big takeaways, I don't think that a lot of the concerns and sort of scenarios that were at the forefront of the Cold War are as important as we think about the future. So the big strategic exchange or bolt from the blue attack seems like a fairly low probability occurrence today. But what you do see and what concerns me is the risk of limited nuclear use, especially in the context of a conventional conflict. So we've thought about this for quite some time with Russia, with its escalate to de-escalate, which I know is controversial, but whatever you want to call Russian nuclear doctrine, where there has been some thought that they might employ a nuclear weapon first if they were in order to end a conflict with NATO on terms that's favorable to it. So there's been some concern. And obviously the war in Ukraine has really raised nuclear concerns to the forefront, because Putin has been quite explicit in brandishing the nuclear arsenal in order to ensure that the United States, NATO, and other countries do not directly intervene and on behalf of Ukraine. But thinking beyond Europe and beyond that context, it's been something that most people have not done very deeply. And I would say that including myself. And most of the war games that I've run, should the red team, whether it was North Korea or China in different scenarios, decide to employ a nuclear weapon, it's like, stop, that wouldn't happen. Or they are forbidden from doing so by the rules of engagement that they're given by the control cell. And it's been just a position where we've put nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear use aside, and because we didn't believe it was very likely, or it wasn't the responsibility of the organization, or the focus of the organization running the game, to think about it. And I think more and more going forward, we actually do need to be thinking about the relationship between this conventional balance and the strategic balance, and what happens in the context of a war under different circumstances, when and why different adversaries may employ a nuclear weapon, and how the United States and its allies and partners can try to deter that and respond to it effectively. This is all happening, and even more alarming because arms control really seems to have fallen apart for the most part. New START's really our only major treaty that is still in effect, and I don't know, I'm fairly pessimistic about it being renewed, although it has been pointed out to me that Russia does still have an interest in ensuring that the United States does not expand its strategic arsenal. But right now, that's going to be a difficult proposition in terms of getting the Senate to pass anything if there were a new treaty that were to be agreed, and expanding the arms control agreements to include China, let alone North Korea right now, seem really like long shots. It's not that we shouldn't begin to try to have those discussions, but Beijing has been very reluctant, and in fact explicitly doesn't want to engage in those sort of conversations, and sees the fact that its nuclear posture is opaque as something that strengthens deterrence. So that's a pretty big impediment to expanding arms control to make it trilateral. One of the other things that I've concluded that I think is really important and worth first stomping is we don't actually need to have balance for the situation to be changed. You don't need strategic parity or supremacy to really significantly alter strategic stability and crisis stability going forward. Parity seems like something that folks overly fixate on. But I think that the trajectory that China is reported to be on, if it actually hits that, is significant enough to change the dynamics and provides the PLA with real operational capability, a lot of options, and a much more secure second strike, which in some ways is a good thing. It can reduce crisis instability, but at the same time may increase the stability and stability paradox and the incentives for China to aggress at lower levels under its nuclear shield. The trilateral nature of the great power nuclear environment is really troubling. I find like threes to be something that's very unstable. I have 3 cats and they fight each other all the time. 2 are always teaming up on the third. With the nuclear powers, I think we've so much of nuclear deterrence theory and thinking has been shaped by the Cold War and the bilateral nature of that relationship. And going forward, we have to think about signaling, which has always been difficult and prone to misperception, miscommunication. Now, when you're trying to signal multiple different parties at the same time, and you're trying to calculate for multiple different potential adversaries, it's really problematic and challenging. And I think the risks of misperception and misunderstanding are increasing. And then you have what the real problem that I see today being that the US has two nuclear armed peer adversaries, and they're different situations. They're very different countries. In Europe, we have NATO. We have a robust, nuclear sharing arrangement with our NATO allies and a long history of that there. And the Russian conventional military, at least in the near term, seems to be declining, while NATO's position is increasing due to increased defense expenditures on the conventional side. But Russia still has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world and non-strategic nuclear arsenal, and it might be more reliant on it going forward. At the same time, you have to look to China, which is has not surpassed the United States probably in terms of its conventional power within theater, but is tipping the balance towards itself, and at the same time is expanding its nuclear capabilities in a way that provide it with significantly more options. And so as you think about having to simultaneously deter these two great powers and then North Korea, I think it's really difficult. Last slide, I promise. So we concluded by saying that you should maintain current US declaratory policy and implement the modernization, which seems to be happening. The Biden administration budget request did not include funding for the SLICM-N, but it looks like Congress is going to add that back in when it passes the NDAA. The bigger issue that I think I'd like to see more emphasis on is thinking about nuclear deterrence and as a part of integrated deterrence. And part of this is we're hobbled because the National Defense Strategy, the unclassified version, hasn't been released. There's some discussion of cost imposition, but also still a theory of denial for being the core of what the US is pursuing in terms of deterrence. I just wanted to emphasize and push that the department not forget about the nuclear side. I think that the shadow of nuclear weapons does fall under all other forms of competition. And while you have other levers of power, like economic sanctions and information is increasingly important, that you can't forget about nuclear deterrence and how it relates to all these other pieces. There's been a lot of focus on gray zone deterrence and threats and activities because those happen every day. But the nuclear balance and the perceptions of that and the role of nuclear weapons in different states' policy is going to matter going forward and affect all these other levels of competition and conflict. My third bullet is don't forget about North Korea. When you look at the peninsula, I think that the situation is actually fairly unstable right now, and that's disconcerting. We still have a policy of pretending that we're going to roll back the North Korean nuclear program, which seems completely unrealistic to me. And when you look at the South Korean policy, which has been renamed, and I can't remember what it is, but the massive punishment and retaliation both have very offensive doctrines, and it seems like that it's potentially a situation that could quickly escalate, which is worrying. That leads to the fourth recommendation, which is studying escalation risk and management techniques across a range of different scenarios. Don't just look at one, you need to think about a bunch of them. The stakes are different. The conventional balances are going to be different. The different allies that might come to your side. So you want to think these situations through, try to understand your potential adversary red lines, flashpoints, their perceptions of the situation so that you are better prepared to manage escalation and prevail. And then finally, while I don't think arms control is necessarily likely in the near term, that doesn't mean you shouldn't continue to talk to China, Russia, and even ideally North Korea, have communication links so that you can reduce the likelihood of miscommunication and perception in the context of a crisis and avoid inadvertent escalation. That is it from me.
All right, thank you, Dr. Pettyjohn. So I will go ahead and adjust our screen view. If you can take down your slides as well. Perfect. All right. So now we're going to proceed to the Q&A portion of today's discussion. So as you have questions, go ahead and submit them to questions-Sarah Canna. All right. So our first question comes from Todd Beasy, and this question is: a lot has been written and discussed regarding enhanced strategic cooperation between China and Russia, particularly to frustrate U.S. leadership and power. What is your assessment of this relationship?
I'm not a Russia or China expert. I have colleagues who focus on that aspect of it, so let me put that caveat up front. I do think that there is a growing level of cooperation or coordination in certain ways, although it's still pretty far removed from what we would consider to be a true alliance of shared interests. That could emerge in the future. Right now, I think that is one of the variables that should be considered in terms of scenario planning and thinking, especially as you're thinking about the two nuclear peer adversary problem. If you consider situations that suggest that, maybe there's an actual real alliance that has emerged between Beijing and Moscow, maybe some sort of middling situation that is more advanced than what we see today, but short of full-scale cooperation, more of some coordination, deconfliction, and then more of where we are, and think about how that impacts different contexts.
All right, thank you. So along sort of similar lines, Larry Kusnar from NSI asked, the US's nuclear adversaries are united in opposing US nuclear power, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of nuclear cooperation between them specifically. In other words, they don't seem to be making nuclear alliances to gang up on the US. Is my perception correct? And if so, what are the implications of numerous unstable triadic relationships between all these nuclear powers?
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, they're not cooperating explicitly in the nuclear sphere. And in fact, I think both of them sort of plan against each other slightly. So they see each other as a potential concern and adversary that they need to take into account. And so that certainly complicates things. What I presented in my talk and the report that Jenny and I did really is just a picture of the overall nuclear landscape, and it gets even worse when you include South Asia and the overlapping security dilemmas where China is looking at India and India is looking at Pakistan, and China and Pakistan are sort of allied. And then you include North Korea, which is sort of close with China, but China doesn't entirely trust either. So all of these sort of overlapping security dilemmas and different concerns that multiple countries have really do make it challenging to figure out how you signal and communicate different deterrence policies, different theories of deterrence, and to make sure that it is strong and credible.
All right, thank you. So one more question that is somewhat focused on China, and this question comes from Anonymous. This question may be too specific or speculative, but how do you envision China's approach towards the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons as part of their war strategy to reunify Taiwan with the mainland?
That is, I think, one of the biggest questions out there. And again, not a China expert. In the war games that I've been running, I found it interesting that the different red team players and China experts have different views on this. And right now, I don't think there's a consensus view, in part because China hasn't updated its military doctrine in quite some time. I think it's like 2013. So it's pretty out of date now. And we've seen a significant change in their capabilities without a corresponding change in their doctrine and their policy that has been shared publicly. And so I think it's important for us to consider a range of possible options And I ultimately fall probably into the realist camp, where I believe that you need to look at capabilities, not necessarily intentions and statements and policy, because if China is developing the capabilities to support different policies or options in the course of a crisis or conflict, and if it chooses to take the big risk and try to unify with Taiwan forcibly, there are a number of different situations where you could imagine that threatening to use or using a nuclear weapon might be advantageous. So in one of the games we ran, the China team sort of mimicked what Russia has tried to do with Ukraine and threatened nuclear use from the beginning, because in an effort to like have the ultimate counter-intervention strategy, right? You don't just have to threaten to attack American forces and air bases with the conventional warheads and ballistic and cruise missiles. You can say that you might use a nuclear weapon. And to my dismay, in all of the games I've been in, none of the blue teams have taken that seriously, because it's such a divergence from where Chinese posture has been in the past and what its articulated policy is, where it still has no first use. And so that's one scenario. You also see others where if the invasion doesn't go well and they get in a long, hard slog, amphibious assaults are really difficult, as any Marine will tell you. Certainly if you've got an adversary with precision-guided weapons, then nuclear use might be used more out of desperation in an attempt to show that Beijing has more interest in that situation and that it's committed to prevail. And that's like a fairly different situation than threatening to use it at the beginning of a conflict in an effort to keep the United States and the rest of the international community out. I do think we want to consider a bunch of these different situations and play games and, have conversations and do research with as many different qualified China experts as possible to see how this evolves and think about what they see China saying and thinking right now. And then also what it makes sense from a strategic and operational perspective for them to do.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pettyjohn, for addressing that question. You had mentioned that China hasn't updated their doctrine on nuclear systems as of late. We have a question from William Parks that relates to U.S. nuclear doctrine. And he asks, I have not been watching nuclear doctrine for almost a decade, but the last time I looked, we, meaning the U.S. military, hadn't necessarily developed any official nuclear doctrine for generations. Has this changed, though?
I think probably other folks on the line are better equipped to answer this than I am. To my knowledge, I don't think this has been, from what I've seen, this is not a focal point for the department as a whole, and something that a lot of people have given it a lot of consideration. I think the most thought has been given to Russia and defending NATO against a potential Russian attack and the situations under which Moscow might feel compelled to use a nuclear weapon, but less so against other potential adversaries.
Okay, thank you. Jay Sebens asks, could you further explain about your pessimism slash skepticism about the potential for renewed or modernized strategic arms control regimes? Is this based mainly on the political challenges with U.S. ratification on such a treaty? And it was recently announced that the U.S. and Russian Federation have agreed to extend the New START treaty through February 4th, 2026.
Yeah, it's based on a couple of different things. So one, you've seen that the trilateral nature of the great power, the balance of power among the three great powers is sort of shaping things already. It certainly has influenced thinking about whether it was worth leaving the INF treaty after Russia violated it, because having conventionally armed intermediate range ballistic missiles could be useful to the United States. And all three of the different poles are looking at each other this way and China is in a position where its nuclear capabilities still are far behind the United States and Russia. So it's actually kind of reasonable for it not to want to adhere to caps when it is still well inferior to the other two. So that's one challenge. Then you have Chinese just sort of strategic thinking and cultural resistance to arms control. They've shown no interest in it and don't want to be involved and actually have a theory of deterrence that's based on not sharing information. Then you just add the number of countries that have to agree. So you go from 2 to 3, that increases complications. And then you look at the status of Russia-United States relations today. And despite New START just getting renewed at the last minute, and we don't know where things will be in 2026, but it's hard to imagine that we're going to have a renewed friendship with Moscow since the war in Ukraine looks like it's going to continue for a while. And hostilities and sort of tension have just generally increased. So that's an impediment. Even if you surmount that and decide strategically it's advantageous for both parties to continue to extend or create something that is largely a continuation of New START for the US and Russia, then you have to get through the Senate. And we know how polarized politics are inside the United States today. And I think that is the final barrier.
Yeah, a lot to grapple with there. So Justin Hall asked, what is the likelihood of Putin getting desperate enough in an endgame situation during the Ukraine conflict to use nuclear weapons, especially in light of their own demographic decline that shows a dim future for Russia?
I think that we're probably in a position where the likelihood of nuclear weapons being used is greater than it has been in recent past, but it's still relatively low. Both sides have obviously been very aware of the other's nuclear capabilities and sort of maneuvered around that. It's shaped what they've been willing to do, how far they've been willing to escalate, what they have and have not done. The threat is there, and they're sort of pushing the boundaries, attacking, I'm forgetting, Lviv, I think is the city in Ukraine where a lot of supplies were coming in, and it's near the Polish border. So there was a missile attack against there not that long ago, though my sense of time is very bad. That sort of pushed the boundaries, but thus far you don't see attacks against airfields or other supply points where US and NATO equipment is coming in and potentially personnel are. So you could imagine like things can continue to tick up and that the risk, while is absolutely low, it still is so concerning because it's consequential and we don't know what happens if a nuclear weapon is employed and how you go from there. And then there's the factor of, Putin's perceptions and thinking about the situation, which I certainly wouldn't speculate much about, but to say that he's made some decisions that many other folks thought were unwise, I think increases those risks and those concerns.
All right, thank you, Dr. Pettyjohn. So Brant Hill asked, a nuclear-free world, in quotes, is a great concept, but in his opinion, unrealistic. So much focuses on nuclear powers, but what about other rogue nations that are currently seeking similar capabilities? He thinks that personally that it's more likely for a rogue nation to use a nuclear weapon than a nuclear power. And do you agree with that?
I don't think we've seen even North Korea or Iran in different ways behave irrationally, according to the strict sense, like the economist sense of what that is. I do think that if you look at some of the dynamics where crisis and stability is greater and fears of preemption when you have a small insecure nuclear arsenal, that might increase the chance of nuclear use. Or if you look at like the case of North Korea, it's a situation where their conventional military power has really waned to such a point relative to the United States and South Korea that they don't have that many other options. And if they get caught in a protracted conflict, they're likely to lose. So nuclear weapons really do end up being kind of their ultimate guarantor and their trump card there. But I don't see states in, thus far, history shows us, thankfully, that states have not just been willing to employ nuclear weapons, that they've always been very circumspect with their use. That could change, and I think there is a greater risk of them being employed as more states get them. And if proliferation continues, that would certainly be troubling.
Okay, thank you. M. Merton asked, to what degree do we think that China's buildup is focused on a similar multipolar nuclear deterrence problem in its immediate neighborhood with Pakistan and India?
I think it absolutely is. I think China has to be looking at India in particular as an immediate threat and a potential enemy. I think it still probably does plan and worry about Russia. It has engaged in sort of a nuclear crisis with Russia or with the Soviet Union in the past, and North Korea and the United States. So I do think that both sides are looking in multiple directions at the same time, which is one of the challenges.
All right, thank you. HDN at Cyndia National Lab asked, given the current environment, this nuclear modernization, long-term reliability, et cetera, is going to be a marathon. Can you discuss the cost imposition to all players? Who wins in the long run? And conventional wisdom says that it's the West, but what are your thoughts?
I don't know. So my understanding is that Russia and China still can produce more fissile material than the United States can and still have sort of open lines for that. While the US sort of has the nuclear material that is already on hand that can be repurposed. So it can't really significantly expand its capacity beyond that limit. So a lot of this depends on what they're planning to do. And sometimes there are other reasons for, nuclear development as well. So who wins out in the cost benefit analysis? It's a tricky thing, and you have to look at the strategic interaction over time. But right now, it appears that the US is in a disadvantaged position because we're kind of we have no option but to be static right now. And everything we do, whether it's creating new delivery systems, takes a lot of time.
It's a huge question to address. So thank you for tackling it. Okay, let's go with this question next from Jeff Becker. And this question is, what are your thoughts on the future of the NPT? Is counterproliferation, in quotes, viable as a strategy? I.e. encouraging an independent ROK or a Japanese deterrent, especially if the ROK and Japan decide to go in the direction on their own? And will extended deterrence commitments from the US require new theater nuclear systems?
Taking the first part of that question, I think, we want to try to strengthen the NPT however possible and however we can. And that's one of the challenges where the United States finds itself today. I think after Ukraine, there has been somewhat of a demonstration effect that nuclear weapons do provide a certain amount of influence and utility in terms of leading the United States to be very careful in how it would intervene in a conflict against a nuclear armed adversary that threatens to use them. But I definitely don't want to encourage allies today to develop nuclear weapons. I think we start having then so many different arms spirals and security dilemmas that it would be incredibly alarming and very destabilizing. So yes, I think we need to look at our extended deterrence commitments and figure out how to strengthen them, especially in the Pacific, where you don't have the rubric of NATO and the nuclear sharing agreements there. Everything's done bilaterally, and the US really hasn't done much on the nuclear side since it withdrew the weapons from South Korea. And there's the added history and complications with our relationship with Japan and their population's views towards nuclear weapons. So I think those are discussions that we need to be having with each of our treaty allies that we that are worried about this situation right now, and how to reassure them. At least we walked away from the idea of sole purpose, which seemed to cause a great bit of alarm in most of our allies, and I don't think would have helped the situation.
All right, thank you. And to our audience members, this is just a quick reminder to make sure to send your questions to questions-Sarah for them to be addressed. Let's go with this question next from Nils W. Carlson. And this question is, what do you think of Rose Gottel-Muller's standstill conundrum and the prospect for exposing second strike capabilities in the next 20 years or so? And how might nuclear powers respond?
I think this is another area that further complicates the picture and that isn't particularly well understood. Her piece cited and some of the work that Brad Robertson has done surveying what different experts have said the impact of new and emerging technologies have on strategic stability or crisis stability. And there's not a lot of agreement. So I think understanding how different domains affect each other and new weapons that can be perceived as being offensive dominant or first strike weapons like hypersonic weapons, is potentially troubling, but there's definitely more work that needs to be done there to think through the relationship between all of those different factors.
All right, thank you. An anonymous person asked, does U.S. nuclear modernization across systems constitute escalatory behavior that could initiate an arms race? Are we already in an arms race, or do our competitors perceive that this modernization to be expected behavior and therefore less threatening?
I think, when you look at, it's always in the eyes of the beholder, which is hard to figure out, and many states do worst case thinking. There's obviously been sort of a conventional arms race between the United States and China that's been going on, where China began to develop the capabilities that allowed it to have its anti-access area denial or counter-intervention strategy conventionally in response to what it saw as overwhelming US long-range strike superiority from the first Gulf War, and then later in 2003 in Afghanistan and all of that. And, there's definitely strategic reactions that are happening. I don't know whether it is the classic definition of an arms race. The US has, failed to modernize its nuclear weapons for so long that it's hard for one to think that that Washington's engaging in a massive nuclear buildup as much as a replacement of systems that are at this point aging out. And I think for at least the SSBNs were going down in number, though it's about the same number of missiles and bombers. We never know where we'll end up. They're talking about 100. So you're not seeing like significant increases that should be hugely alarming, but that doesn't mean that other states don't view them that way. I do think the other piece of this is missile defenses, which clearly are seen as a part of some sort of damage limitation strategy and something that could be used to neutralize or reduce the strength of their second strike capability of potential states. Like China certainly should be alarmed. They only have something like 250, 300 warheads right now. If US missile defenses could intercept 50 or 60 of those, that's actually a reasonable proportion. For the Russians, less so, but they've always been very worried about missile defenses and seen them as a sign of hostile intentions.
right, thank you, Dr. Pettyjohn. So it looks like we have time for a few more questions. I'll throw this one out there from William Clift. And this question is, I appreciate your review and presentation in a multipolar age. For a long time, we've refused to believe that the DPRK would develop nuclear weapons, but now they have. How do we address a multipolar age with Iran eventually thrown into the mix?
I don't have an answer to that. And I think that this is where you start to really see situations that can become alarming, where in the Middle East you have partner states that also have relationships with other states with nuclear weapons. And you can imagine this proliferation cascade occurring because so many of the countries there view Iran as very hostile. But it definitely would draw attention back, I think, to the Middle East again.
Speaking of that, Stephen Schinkel asked, how do you address Israel's deterrence posture against Iran? If Iran develops a nuclear weapon, how does this impact the dyad between them? And how would it impact the US, in your opinion?
I mean, Israel, it's always hard to assess Israel's posture given its ambiguity. Israel has obviously been unwilling to accept an Iranian, nuclear armed Iran, and has taken steps to prevent that from materializing. And I suspect that they will continue to try to do so and are much more likely to try to have different types of preventive attacks, whether they're kinetic or not, to impede the progress of their nuclear weapons program. I do think it becomes a very troubling situation, but the dynamics have changed quite a bit too. This isn't just Israel versus Iran anymore. You see that relations between a lot of the Arab Gulf states and Israel are much friendlier than they have been in the past. And that could factor into what happens in the overall balance going forward. And I don't really know whether it would be stabilizing or not. I think Iran developing a nuclear weapon would be a bad thing, but sadly, given the prospects for the JCPOA going forward, looks increasingly likely.
Thank you, Dr. Pettyjohn. Major Chris Wagner from iCorp's G2 has asked, what is being done globally to establish proper use criteria for the employment of nuclear munitions, specifically because countries define tactical nukes differently?
I don't think there are use criteria or even norms other than the nuclear taboo that nuclear weapons shouldn't be used. And for a while, the idea that nuclear weapons were useful seemed to be fading away. But I think Ukraine has changed that. I do think the vernacular is outdated and needs to be revised as we think about this much more complicated situation going forward. Tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons was totally driven by our definition and the situation, geographic separation between the United States and the Soviet Union. When you look at China today, for instance, and it's trying to think about deterrence, the United States is still far away, and what would be strategic or non-strategic would be the same. But if it's thinking about India or countries that are on its border, like Russia, those are strategic deterrent systems, but they might not be long-range systems, and they might not necessarily be as high of yield too. So I think that there needs to be sort of some consideration to how we talk about these different types of systems going forward that's more applicable globally into the new environment where there are more nuclear armed states and more nuclear rivalries.
Thank you, Dr. Pettyjohn. Let's squeeze in one last question before we conclude. And we did have some questions that we weren't able to address today. So please feel free to send me those questions via email if you'd like me to pass them along to Dr. Pettyjohn, and I will do that. But this last question that we have time for is from Ken Gernhardt. And this question is, as you know, deterrence rests on capability and credibility. How do you assess the strength of America's strategic deterrence right now?
Well, the other thing about deterrence is deterrence for what, right? I think the the strength of US strategic deterrence for attacks against the US homeland is strong. I think the area where there are potential weaknesses and where it needs to be shored up is extended deterrent commitments to allies and partners. And that's always been the weak point where there have been questions about the credibility of the US to follow through and whether it would risk escalation and attacks on itself in order to save another country.
Well, Dr. Pettyjohn, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your insights with the SMA community. Thank you everyone for tuning in today, and we appreciate your support and questions. Hope to see you on the next one, and have a great day.